Welcome along to today's session. My name is Dr. Sam Coley, and I want to be talking to you about documentary production, specifically how to come up with great ideas to make compelling documentaries. So if you just give me a moment, I'm going to share my screen so we can follow the PowerPoint together. Here we go. So I'm from the BA and the MA in media production here at Birmingham City University, and you can see my email address there. I'll show it again at the end of this talk. So if there's anything that comes up that you want some more questions about, you're not sure about, just let me know and I'll be happy to work through that with you. So here's where we're based. This is the Parkside building at Birmingham City University, the Curzon building, and this is one of the studios that our students use to create documentaries. We have a great range of courses that explore documentary production, both audio and visual documentaries. We've got a green screen room, some fantastic studios that the students are able to hire out. As I say, radio as well as television studios. And this is the website for our BA in media production and our MA in media production. So if you do want to find out more, you could visit those websites. They're quite easy to search for, and that'll give you all the information about our documentary production courses and classes. But the reason you're here today is finding the story. So this is all about documentary development. But first, I wanted to just explore what is a documentary. They're very popular at the moment, but it's worth just taking a little bit of time to figure out what a documentary actually is. What does it mean? And if we looked at some academic citations, then Grierson says that a documentary is the creative treatment of actuality. Starkey says it's a means of communicating a story. And I think this is interesting, this idea of actuality, something that actually happened, facts. And also, as Starkey says, the communication of a story. So all good documentaries will involve some sort of a story. Professor Tim Crook says that documentaries depict or represent a real rather than an imaginary world. So again, this idea of facts, reality coming through. And for Rabiger, documentaries should seek to provide truthful representations and have a profound fascination with and respect for actuality. So we're talking about the representation of fact, truth, authenticity. There's always going to be a sense of bias because, you know, as documentary producers, we can't help but bring our own emotions and thoughts to a documentary. But at the end of the day, documentaries are stories from life. They're things that happen around us, maybe not to us necessarily, although they can be, but they're stories that come from everyday life. And I think this is a really good thing to keep in mind when you're trying to come up with ideas, that, you know, you don't have to come up with big documentaries that are going to change the world. Everyday stories from life are a really rich ground for coming up with great documentary concepts. Types of documentaries. Well, if you go on Netflix, I mean, there's any sort of documentary you can imagine. And just here you can see, for example, true crime documentaries, historical documentaries, inspiring documentaries, animal documentaries, you name it. Technically, Nichols says that these 6 areas are the types of documentaries that kind of cover a wide range. But if we were to drill down into subject matter and themes to try and come up with certain ideas or to help us along the way, then this is a pretty good indicator of the types of documentaries that you can expect to come across. Okay, but how do you come up with a great idea for a documentary? Now, my main point is, don't just wait for inspiration to hit you. Don't just wander around thinking that, you know, I really hope a good idea is going to come my way, because that's not the way it works. You might get lucky sometime, but actually you have to work hard to come up with good ideas, and you actually have to work at it. So don't be too tough on yourself, but I think a really good starting point is to understand how you best work. And what I mean by that is, are you a morning person? Are you an evening person? Give yourself the creative space to come up with ideas by setting aside some time where you can, you know, make use of whatever works best for you. So if you can find a few minutes in the morning, if that's when you've got your fresh ideas, or maybe when the day's out of the way and you're relaxing at night, that's the time to put aside some time and try to come up with some ideas, but you need to work at it. One good tip is to keep a journal or a notebook, or even just a folder on your desktop where you can store screenshots of interesting things that you might come across when you're browsing the web, or even just sitting on the bus. You know, you've got to be curious. And if you can just sort of keep a note of things that you've heard people say, whether it's overhearing or you're looking at a local website and you see a story about somebody that you think that's kind of interesting, keep a record of it, keep a note of it, because by doing that, you're going to be able to start getting in the zone of finding stories and ideas, capturing them. And you never know when one might sort of grow into a broader concept. Another good tip is to seek feedback. So by that, I mean brainstorm. Don't keep your ideas to yourself. Other people can really help. So share your ideas. Don't be afraid to sort of bounce them around, whether it's at a cafe over a coffee, or even somebody at work or at university, or wherever you're based. Have a chat to somebody, share your ideas, and you never know, they might have a simple twist, a little key that unlocks a bigger picture that you hadn't thought of. You know, it might not have occurred to you, but by sharing the idea, discussing it, bouncing back and forth, that idea can maybe take some shape, get bigger, and grow into something even more than you could have imagined. Okay, at the end of the day, though, you're going to need that story. Remember, I said documentaries are stories from life. So what is your story? And stories, you know, if you're watching a film or a play, or even if you're reading a book, they all have a traditional sort of form whereby at the start we introduce the characters, then we move ahead. The location becomes clear. The different people in that character story reveal themselves. We have some sort of rising tension. There's some sort of plot development. Perhaps there's some sort of scenario that's unfolding. And then usually in the middle, there comes some sort of challenge, some sort of difficulty that our hero has to overcome. And then we have the resolution that comes from that dramatic moment where things resolve themselves or they don't, or we end by asking some other questions of what comes next. But really, that follows the traditional story path, the 3-act story, you might call it. And if you can find a story that has those elements, you're going to do well. And really, some sort of conflict is really valuable for your documentary. So if you can find some sort of story that has an element of conflict in it, that's a good thing. It doesn't have to be, you know, aggressive, violent conflict. It could just be a misunderstanding or somebody's life's taken a wrong turn. Anything like that has an element of storytelling because we want to know what happens next. And if you can hold the audience's attention so that they can't wait to hear what happens next, then you're going to have a great documentary. So how do you find the story? Well, first off, and this goes for any sort of media project, who's your audience? You have to know your target audience. It's crucial that you know who you're making your piece for. It's really, really vital. So have a clear idea of not just the person, but the platform that your work is going to be intended for, because that's going to inform your production decisions. The language you use, the music you use, the length of the documentary, perhaps, all these elements come from the audience. So have a clear idea of who that audience is. Now, you need to find an interesting story, something that's going to translate well onto your chosen media platform. So, for example, if it's going to be a radio or a podcast story, then it needs to have sonic sound elements that are going to come through clearly, not just sitting in a studio necessarily, but going out into the real world, sound effects. Maybe there's some music you could add to it. Maybe there's some contextual archival clips that you can add to it. But find an interesting story and make sure that it's got all the elements to hold the audience's attention. Challenge your existing thinking. I want you to be asking yourself, why? Why is this story interesting? Why did this person do this? Be genuinely curious. And if you find the story interesting, then chances are your audience is going to find it interesting too. If you think it's a boring story, guess what? Your audience is probably going to find it boring too. So if you're going to go ahead with a documentary, it always helps to believe in it. It might sound obvious, but if you can really commit and be passionate about the story and have an obligation to try and present your characters, your contributors in a positive light, then hopefully that's going to help you to make a really compelling documentary. I think this is a good point too. It's okay to think small. So you don't have to make a documentary about global warming or, political crises. You can just make something small about your local community. And if you do that well, then by unlocking that small story, you'll often reveal a bigger picture. So I think it's really interesting, challenging yourself, not necessarily to think of huge, ambitious ideas. Sometimes the best documentaries are actually centered around really small, self-contained ideas that you can maximize and tell really well. So it's better to make a small story that's well told than a large story that's kind of lacking in direction. Okay, with that in mind, don't overlook what's right in front of you. So, as I mentioned, the best documentaries are sometimes, stories from life, things that are happening around you. So the examples I have here, maybe your cousin has a strange pastime, he plays a weird sport or something, or maybe you had a friend who had a near-death experience, maybe your grandma saw a ghost and you talk about that. Whenever you get together and have dinner, it's become a bit of a family story. We tend to take these things for granted because we know them and we're aware of them, but actually that might be really interesting to somebody that has never heard that story before or doesn't know about that person. So what I'm saying is don't overlook the obvious. There may be somebody around you that is a really good subject for a simple documentary. In other words, a story from life. It's also okay to be quite vague at the start. You might not have a clearly defined story. It might just be a kind of an idea, a theme, some sort of a general idea. And that's kind of okay sometimes, because if you've got a general area of interest, you can start digging down, and that may be the process that reveals the story. So if you've got a general idea, start your research, start talking to people, and maybe the specific story will reveal itself through doing that. You've got to ask yourself, has the story been told before? So look around again, do some research, Google, see what's out there, and see if there's a similar story, or if somebody's covered it before. And if it has been done before, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it shows that at least somebody else was interested in it. And it's incredibly hard to find a new story, so to speak, but you can certainly tell an old story in a new way. So you can take, an established sort of storyline, but you bring your own perspective to it. You tell it through your own lens and through the people that have experienced it from their perspective. And maybe that brings a uniqueness and a freshness and a distinctiveness that you'll need to make a great documentary. Now, sometimes the story's about you. You could be the topic. You could be the person for your documentary. And that is the simplest approach to making a documentary. This is what happened to me. Let me tell you about it. So that's a very, useful approach. The audience, in a sense, follows you as you go on your journey of discovery. So you kind of say, I wasn't sure about this. I don't know what it means. Come with me. Let's find out together. And so you've got a kind of a narrative story there as the audience travels with you, as you put yourself in that situation, discover about it, and then have your reflections at the end. What did you learn from that? What happened? What are you going to do next? But if you are going to be the presenter, if the story is going to be about you, then you have to put yourself out there. You have to make yourself available. You have to be honest. You have to be revealing in some ways. And you really need to think carefully about that. If it's a traumatic situation, a traumatic experience that happened to you, then, do you really want to be putting that out in public? Don't exploit yourself, in other words, because in years to come, you might regret that. So think carefully about it if you're going to make the story about you. Okay, some other tips. Always be looking. As I said before, if you're sitting on a train and somebody's got telling a story in front of you, eavesdrop. It's not illegal, but they may have a really interesting story there. And interesting people make for interesting stories. So you need to be watching, looking, being aware, always keeping notes of great ideas that maybe you can come back and develop later. Draw on your own interests, draw on your own experiences. There's nothing wrong with using your own contacts. I mentioned before about the idea of using family members or friends. They can often make really great ideas for documentaries. Ask around, see if anybody's got any ideas or, can help you develop a story. As I said, seeking feedback, brainstorming is good. You can use social media, a great way to speed that sort of process up. Here's a good tip: follow up on past events. So there might have been something that happened in your town 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and it was a big event at the time, but what happened afterwards? Maybe that story hasn't been told. The aftermath of that event could be good. It doesn't have to be a disaster or something, but following up can be a really great way to develop an idea. And that sort of lends into anniversaries. So if it is, say, 20 years or 30 years or 40 years or 5 years since something happened, or 1 year since something happened, then that can be quite a useful way to start an idea and crucially get some sort of a commissioner, some sort of a platform interested in your idea. Because it's very easy to say, hey, next month's the 5th anniversary of this singer dying or this album coming out. And they might say, yeah, I hadn't thought of that. 5 years, my goodness, great. I'm making a documentary on it. Would you be interested? So anniversaries, keep them in mind. They can be a great way to kickstart a concept. This is a documentary I made myself that demonstrates that. So Absolute Radio played a documentary I made about the album Let's Dance by a musician called David Bowie. That was marking the 30th anniversary of that album. And it was relatively easy to get that documentary commissioned because they were interested in that artist. They hadn't thought that it was 30 years, so it made it a simple proposition. Okay, now this is the heart of what I wanted to talk about today. It's the difference between having an idea and having a story. So an idea is basically a general theme, and the story is the angle. What's different? What's distinctive about that theme? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what I mean by this, because, if you're trying to come up with a great documentary, just coming up with an idea, it's a starting point, but it's not the whole picture. You actually need to work harder and try and find the real story, the theme behind that idea. Okay, so here's a good example. This was a documentary called Healing Horses. So the theme, the idea was mental health. Yeah, I'm making a documentary about mental health. Well, I mean, that's such a huge subject. How are you going to tackle that? All right, well, the actual story or the angle is horses being used to help people deal with trauma, deal with mental health. Having a horse, an animal to care for, can be quite therapeutic. So that is the story, the theme. So the bigger idea, the bigger picture is mental health, but the actual story, the angle, is healing horses. And here's just a little overview. If you want to look back, you can stop this. But basically, healing horses, looking at, working with children, ex-gang members, addicts, people with learning disabilities, and giving them a chance to care for horses in a way to help deal with it. So that's a really good approach to coming up with an idea, a story about horses and mental health. The next one, homelessness. Okay, that's another huge theme, a huge idea, but what's the story? Well, this documentary was about what was homelessness like in the past. So giving it a distinctive angle, a distinctive story, looking at the history of homelessness. It's not just a modern problem, it's been around for a long time. So that was the story, the angle. Homelessness was the theme, the big picture, the big idea, but the story, the angle, was this historical aspect. So I think that's quite interesting. This idea of saying, here's my big picture, here's the area I'm interested in, but this is the key that unlocks it. This is the story that lets me tell something about homelessness in a way that's really going to connect with people. And this is a documentary that one of my students made a few years ago now. And unfortunately, a homeless man, he died. He died in the heart of Birmingham. It was a very sad event, but she had actually met him a couple of weeks beforehand, and she was very moved by this because she'd given him some money. She'd had a chat to him. She felt some sort of connection. But she took that and turned it into a story, not just about homelessness, but about this one person and his life. And she used archival footage. She did a really great job finding out from people who knew him, finding out from experts, but intrinsically telling this one person. So it's a wonderful example of a bigger sort of theme, the idea of homelessness, but then coming up with a specific story to help tell that particular person's life story. And she made a story called This Ain't My Life. Hopefully you can find it somewhere because it's a wonderful piece of work and a great testament to this person's life. And actually, she went on to receive a gold medal for it, which is a wonderful result for her. And something that I'm quite keen to promote as well. If you're going to the trouble of making a documentary, then try and get some recognition for it. You know, don't be afraid to put it out there and try and get it heard or viewed. You know, and try and get some industry recognition, because if you're looking to make another documentary, then having that sort of industry appreciation is a great way to help build your career. And it was broadcast on BBC Radio 4, which was a wonderful result. Okay, so that's me. Those are just a few main ideas talking about documentary production, trying to kickstart some ideas, trying to come up with some ways to get your concepts out there. You know, keep a note of different ideas. Some of the best documentary producers I know have, you know, as many as 60 concepts on the go at any one time. They're all at different levels of proficiency. So, you know, some are just general thoughts, concepts, ideas. Some of them are really well developed with contributors already worked out, but they have this raft of concepts that they can draw on, because one of the key things that you're going to be asked when it comes to commissioning a documentary idea is why now? Why is the story useful now? I talked about anniversaries and these sorts of things. You know, having some sort of reason. Maybe it's a particular time of year. Maybe if we were looking at homelessness, there's you know, a homelessness week in your country where you know, try and address the issues of homelessness. That week might be a good time to try and get your documentary broadcast. But if you've got a whole range of different ideas, what I'm saying is, at different times, those ideas might come to life. There might be an event that happens somewhere in the world that really is something to do with this idea you're developing here. And so you can take that idea and use it and seize the moment, is what I'm saying. You're not having to start from scratch. You've got a range of concepts that are already ready to be used. So this is our building at Birmingham City University. My name again is Dr. Sam Coley. Here's my email address. So as I said earlier, if you do have any questions or you've got any thoughts or you'd just like to get in touch, maybe you've got a documentary idea and you'd like me to have a, you know, a look at it and give you some thoughts, I'd be more than happy to do that. So don't be a stranger, just drop me a line. And thank you again for your time. I'm going to be available now on this Zoom conversation, so that if you did want to have a more immediate chat to me, I'll be available for any questions you might have. So thank you again for watching, and all the best.